Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Paula Goldman is Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer of the technology firm Salesforce. She and her team have been working on responsible AI for more than 5 years. We talk about the origins of the group, how they've evolved, where they fit within the company, the emergent challenges of AI agents, and ultimately why she's optimistic, both about policy developments and the potential of organizations to get their arms around the real challenges of trust in AI. Please enjoy my conversation with Paula Goldman. Paula, welcome to the podcast. Really a pleasure having you here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You were one of the first people, I think, who was hired in a role like yours, dealing with ethical and humane use of technology in a major company. How did you first get started? What were the first things that you did in setting up this program at Salesforce?
Yeah, I came on board at the beginning of 2019. If we can rewind back to that moment in time, I think there were a lot of swirling questions about the role of technology. They were not necessarily all specific to AI per se, or at least that wasn't the language that was being used at the time. But I think to Salesforce's credit, they foresaw that, that these weren't one-off questions, but more that this was a practice and a discipline that needed to have leadership across the company. And so they created this Office of Ethical and Humane Use at Salesforce. But the role it wasn't necessarily super well defined. And so what we did at first was a couple of things. We worked on really clarifying principles, an initial set of policies, customer-facing policies around product end use. But equally, we really focused internally on culture and employee participation, knowing that there's no sort of team or set of individuals that has all the answers or can anticipate all of the uses of technology, but really starting with building a culture where this is everyone's responsibility and everyone should be asking these questions was a really strong starting point for us.
How do you build that kind of culture?
Well, it can start with finding lots of different channels for employees to ask questions, right? And some of those might be formal channels and some might be informal, some might be, with their names attached, and some might be confidential. So for example, we use a sort of ethics point reporting channel where employees can confidentially ask questions or report concerns about the uses of our technology. And we have a sort of process for vetting those types of things. We invite employees to sit on our Ethical Use Advisory Council, which also has executives from across the company and external experts. And then it's really about the tone from the top, holding participatory events, and finding ways to bubble up these themes across the org. And it's an ongoing effort. It's never really done.
You mentioned that your role is broader than AI. How specifically does AI fit in with this framework of ethical and humane use? And what's distinctive about the kinds of practices you're doing around AI responsibility?
Yeah, well, I will say AI is a huge focus, and particularly in the last few years. But we've been working on responsible AI for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years at this point. And the only reason that I said that the role is broader is because I think we sometimes forget when we talk about AI is also about data. It's also about the interfaces that are built on top of these models and whatnot. So I'm responsible for making sure that everything all the products that we ship out into the world are good for the world, so to speak, for mitigating any unintended consequences or negative consequences and finding all the positive use cases and amplifying them. But I will say AI is really core to that. And particularly when we think about heading towards AI agents and whatnot, and like very complex set of questions that come with that.
So what are some of the ways that your program has evolved as AI has come to the fore more? We know generative AI being a significant piece. What are some of the things that have changed along the way?
So when we look at generative AI and the transformation from AI making predictions to creating content to now more and more taking action on our behalf, the risks that come up are not necessarily new, but almost with a different accent, right? Different emphasis. And so, for example, with predictive AI, accuracy was an issue, was a question, but we weren't thinking about so called hallucinations in the same way. And we didn't. And so, right now, when we talk to customers about generative AI, that question, how do I know the answer is accurate, is at the top of the list. Similarly, when we think about toxicity, potential for generative AI to create answers that might offend, that also is not an issue so much with predictive AI. So we had to create a new set of principles and then working with our product team. So we have this whole suite of generative AI products across marketing, commerce, and so on, service. We work to create a set of guardrails directly in the product itself that are addressing these key questions around trust. Everything from zero data retention, so making sure that our customers' data is stays within the guardrails and does not go get used to train some third-party model, to a toxicity detector that helps customers, understand and set guardrails around that type of content. And there's so much more there. But it was really exciting for me and continues to be very exciting to work on those because these products show me that trustworthy AI as a goal is a set of innovations and it can really help to make product outcomes much better.
So how much can these kinds of problems like hallucination, toxicity, and so forth be solved by these technical mechanisms? And how much has to go to the kinds of things you were talking about before, culture or other kinds of techniques?
It's a great question. And I think it comes down to context and specifics, right? So, we, as much as possible, because we're an enterprise company, not a consumer company, we try to turn the controls over on these types of questions to customers. Well, take, for example, the question of toxicity. You just referred to it, right? So, when you think about what type of content would you want or not want, you might have a brand that's super edgy. And so maybe a curse word here and there is okay. And then maybe you are a huge multinational consumer brand and that is not okay, right? We want to be, as much as possible, turning over those thresholds for customers to define for themselves. And that's where I think there's a sort of way of thinking about it, of defining the problem and of measuring it. But then you want to be able to let the decisions be context specific. I would say somewhat similar answer to the question around accuracy, although, as you know, I mean, I think there have been really rapid improvements with that as LLMs have gotten better and better and foundation models have gotten more and more advanced. And that's been a very rapid advancement. There are certain techniques and technical innovations, so to speak, that have been incredibly helpful across our customer base. One of them is retrieval augmented generation, essentially, this notion of saying, instructing the model not to answer a question unless it finds the answer in some trusted data. But then also, there's also room for context, right? So you might want a really creative answer to your question, right? And so you might want, for example, to set the temperature on the model that you're using to be very, very flexible and creative, or you might want only a very precise answer to the question. So I still think it's important to keep, sufficiently aware of the answers to these questions being context dependent.
And it's really interesting. Do you have to do a lot to educate many of your customers about those issues so they know what knobs to turn?
Yeah, I mean, we work very, very closely with our customers on these topics. We provide a lot of in product documentation and a lot of sort of generally available, like we have a platform called Trailhead, which does free courses around these types of topics. And I would say it's not just our customers, right? It's the whole ecosystem, and in particular, I would say lots of folks, individuals just thinking about their own careers that are really hungry to think about these issues and how does it affect us at work and what's the future of generative AI at work. And I think these questions could not be more important at this moment in time.
Hmm. Let me ask you about a few organizational questions. One of the issues that comes up a lot is where do you put a group like yours? Does it go in legal or compliance? Does it go in product? Does it go in lots of other places? I know you went through an evolution about where you sit within Salesforce. I'd love to hear about how you think about that.
Yeah. As it turns out, I sit in both orgs at the same time. I sit in product and in legal. And that's extremely useful because in fact there's so much overlap. Well, that is to say, when you have a group that's really looking at the impact of product in the world, you want to be there in the product development life cycle. Hence, sitting in product, being really deep in the life cycle of product development and whatnot. And at the same time, it is legal and government affairs. There's so much regulatory activity happening right now. There's so many really important and encouraging conversations happening in the public. And the intersection of that with legal policies and stuff like that needs to also be really at the forefront. So it's a pleasure to be able to go and operate across both orgs. And really, honestly, we operate across the whole company because we have to and we need to.
How do you build those relationships and connections, especially with the product groups? They want to ship something, they want to get out there, they want to meet customer needs, and you may be slowing them down, asking those kinds of questions.
I see a lot of the work that we do is around translation. So there's a lot of foundational work that's like, how do you assess these risks? What are the technical mitigations for the risk? What are the policy mitigations for the risks? How do we think about all of that as a suite of tools together? And then a lot of it is translating to, okay, what's the goal for this product? What's the business goal for the product? What are the customers trying to achieve? Why do these mitigations, these innovations make these outcomes better? And then how do you think about even stacking and ranking some of these goals as they come together? And so we spend a lot of time on that and posing these questions to cross-functional groups of stakeholders internally, and a lot of it is relationship building, but it going back to that word translation, it's about taking these questions and putting them into the framework that these groups are already operating on and helping them understand why these are such important questions to be asking. And I will say that has become super clear in the last couple of years because generative AI, I think one of the interesting things that's happened is that as this technology captured public imagination and people were playing around with publicly available versions of the technology, it was at least the first time in my memory that we're talking about the promise and potential of the technology at the same time as we're talking about in the very early days, the risks of the technology. And those risks are top of mind for all of our customers and for individuals. And so it makes that conversation internally very fluid and very easy to have because it's not coming out of the blue.
What are the risks that are most compelling for those stakeholders that really encourage them to see the need for these kinds of interventions?
You mean internal or external?
I'm curious if it's a different answer for each of them.
Well, I will say our customers, and again, remember we serve mostly businesses, large and small. I would say the question of the integrity of their data is
Mm.
top of mind, making sure that their customer confidential data stays confidential and that they're in control of it. That is followed probably by, I mean, maybe that goes hand in hand, I should say, with the questions that we were talking about earlier around accuracy and being able to then subsequently control thinking about tone and toxicity and those types of questions as they come up. Salesforce is in large part, again, we're helping customers connect with their own customers. We're helping companies connect with customers, right? In large part, we're not talking about high risk decision making for the most part. So we're not talking about deciding whether someone gets a job or a loan or access to housing, that kind of thing. And so it's not quite the same as those discussion of risks as you might find with some of those higher risk use cases as exist in the world of AI.
What else is distinctive about Salesforce's culture that's relevant to the work that you do?
Well, I'd say it's been a mission driven company from the very beginning. From the very beginning, trust has been our number one value. It's never moved. And Salesforce, I think, had to walk that talk really early because if you may recall, it was introducing cloud technology at a time when people were skeptical of it, right? And so it had to it had to walk the talk in the sense of product innovations, but also in terms of consistently following a set of values. And an example of that is very early on, the company put up a trust site. So one of the objections to putting customer data or putting a company's data into the cloud was, well, what if it fails? Like, what if it's not available? Right. And so very early on, Salesforce put up this site that very transparently put up, statistics about outages and when it was up and when it was down. It's that kind of thinking that has been with the company for so long. And I see this as an extension of it. There's not necessarily, as you know very well, Kevin, there's not necessarily yet a set of commonly recognized, standards for how to do at least the generative part well. I think it's evolving quickly, but, we're just pushing the frontier on it within the company and working with stakeholders outside the company to keep learning and sharing best practices back and forth.
How do you think about what trust means in this context of responsible AI? It's a great example in the early days of the cloud where trust is just, is my data there or not? Is the thing
Yeah.
up or not? Everyone loves to talk about trust. And I've written books about trust, and I think it's critically important in the AI context. But
Yeah.
how do you understand exactly what that means?
Well, I think it's the questions that we were just talking about. Like, is this outcome accurate? Does it align with my brand? Is it giving the right information to the right customer at the right time? Right. I mean, these are very sort of standard things that you might expect from type of technology that we develop. Now, there's, I think, there's sort of two layers I might add onto that. One, I would say, I think that there's a sort of meta layer to trust for AI right now. I believe it was Rachel Botsman who said that, define trust as a confident relationship with the unknown. I think our customers understand that this technology is moving very quickly and that the questions that they're asking today may be different than the questions that they need to ask tomorrow. And some of this is just about the relationship that we build overall over time. That do we continue as a company to keep asking the right questions, being transparent about what we're learning, where we got it right and where we got it wrong? So I think that is very much the kind of meta part of what's going on with AI right now. And I would also say, and maybe this is kind of follows directly from that, we're really at an inflection point as we think about AI agents, because that is a very, very different set of outcomes. And it is a very different way of interacting with AI, has the potential to just really upend how we interact with technology overall. And so for that, when we think about, a single prompt, for example, generating an entire email campaign that might generate a million emails, we're thinking very much about, okay, so how do we evolve the set of controls that we give customers to be able to trust that, right? And some of it is about these sort of the new control panels, right? So the control panels that might, if you think about like the history of technology and the design of, for example, panels for airplanes so that pilots didn't make errors, that kind of thing. I think it's a similar moment for AI agents right now, where and what we've been working on is these sort of pre-control panels where you might be able to say, here's my prompt and get a preview of what it looks like and to, turn the dials up and down on tone and whatnot. And then post-control panels, what we have an audit trail in our trust layer. And that audit trail will show you what's been all the feedback on the content generated. And you might be able to then identify anomalies and whatnot, and then go back and correct and keep fine-tuning those outcomes. And I think very much directionally, that's where we have to be headed for AI, is these sort of macro views of how it's going, in addition to the micro, is this individual piece of content, did it do what I wanted it to do, kind of thing.
Hmm. You've been talking recently about the importance of humans at the helm instead of
Yes.
the usual formulation, humans in the
Yeah.
loop. So what exactly does that mean in
That's
this
exactly,
context?
well, that's exactly what I was trying to get at.
Okay.
So for a long time with AI, we've been talking about this notion of human in the loop. And with generative AI, what that has colloquially translated to is, I'm going to let a generative AI model draft I'm going to send a note to Kevin, draft an email to Kevin that tells him what a great time I had on this podcast, right? And and then I'm going to edit it before I send it over and just make sure it really represents me. Well, that may still be appropriate in a lot of cases, but as we move to the world of agents where AI is taking action on our behalf, it may not be practical in all instances, because they're getting better and better at executing action at scale, right? And so we need the next set of controls, the next set of making sure that, we like to say, you don't always necessarily need to have a person rowing the boat, but you absolutely need a person in charge of steering the ship, right? They need to know what's going on. They need to be able to verify it's going well. They need some controls in case it's not going well. And that's what we call human at the helm, which is we like to see as a more powerful approach to keeping people in control of AI as its powers continue to evolve.
Yeah, the talk about agents and these concerns as the technology evolves, for me, brings up this whole AI safety debate and the people who are focused on the frontier models and the even potential existential threats of AI. Do you worry that discussion gets too much airtime and distracts from the kind of immediate practical issues with the technologies that companies like yours are actually deploying today?
I guess I would say a couple of things. One is, I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy. And I wrote a piece about this in Foreign Affairs, but I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it seems to me, or I feel very strongly, that the controls we develop today for the problems we're experiencing right now and the problems we anticipate coming down the road are how we build muscle memory for, and honestly, technological insight into more and more complex forms of AI. And that's how it's always been. It's not like we're starting from scratch. For example, on trustworthy AI, we're building on years of study and years of innovation around topics like fairness and bias and so on, right? And that will remain true. So yes, I think that we're to some degree overlooking the importance of these current day investments as they create the bridge to make sure that the trust innovation keeps pace with general innovation. So that's how I see it.
And what about the torrent of regulation that's here now or coming around the world in this area? How does that impact on the work that you do?
Well, I am honestly delighted to see this level of attention from regulators, particularly happy about the framing of the EU Act. And I know there's still some stuff that is being worked out, but generally speaking, taking a risk based approach and regulating AI based on particular types of outcomes or decision making versus, you know, particular models, which I don't think is not to say I don't want to cast it in totally dichotomous terms, because there's a place for focusing on very powerful models, particularly in kind of like national security concerns and elements. But I think sitting where I do, where serving the enterprise, there is a very big difference between the risk level of drafting an email for a customer versus deciding whether that customer qualifies for a loan. And so I think that type of regulation is quite appropriate and helpful. And generally speaking, I sit on the National AI Advisory Committee, which advises the White House on AI. And that I think there's been a number of steps forward as well in the executive order in the United States and whatnot. There's much more to go. Obviously the political environment can be quite challenging, but it's really important that we have a set of guardrails. And I think that set of guardrails can unlock innovation, unlock companies going faster.
Yeah, where do you think we're going in the US, given that challenge, as you mentioned, of getting legislation through?
Well, my hope, I will say, I think you gotta not forget the basics, right? We need a national privacy bill. We've gotten close a few times.
We have a bill.
Right. Well, we need a national privacy law. We've gotten close, and I'm cautiously optimistic about that. And then I think there's a number of, as ongoing debates about treating AI as its own regulatory concern versus as a kind of topic specific regulatory concern, be it in medicine or in finance or whatnot. And I think, again, I think we need both as well. So, we'll see. A lot really rides on kind of what happens across the next set of elections and whatnot. But generally speaking, I've also been encouraged by the fact that it's a bipartisan area of interest. So you don't always get that. And I think that's great.
And just in general, what do you see as the biggest challenges coming in this area of trustworthy or responsible AI in the next few years?
You know, if you'll allow me to geek out for a moment, I, certainly there's no shortage of questions and challenges, right? Be it disinformation that people are worried about, or be it just generally being able to trust the outcome that you're working towards, and a lot of progress made on that latter piece. What I really think I'm thinking a lot about is the use of AI in the workplace and how important it is for the products we design and the ways that we integrate AI into the workplace to give people their own sense of what AI is good at and what it's not good at, and also what people are good at and where they may have their own cognitive biases that AI can really help with, right? So if we do this right, we can get, we design for the strengths of both and we get better outcomes, right? We get, doctors who are able to not have to spend time taking notes, but can check for inaccuracies and then also watch for subtle cues in the patient interaction that might not, be evident otherwise, right? Or we get salespeople and service people, same thing, being able to really focus on the relationships with their customers and not have to spend the time looking up the context of what might, a customer that might need to return an item, and they've got that all that information at their fingertips via an AI in their CRM system. And so much more as we think about agents entering the workplace. I think it's really important though that people really understand what they can trust and what they can't trust, and they've got the appropriate tools for that, right? And it's not as often that we talk about that. It's not as often that we talk about also the sort of behavioral science piece of it and which interventions really help add what we call at Salesforce a little bit of mindful friction to the interface, and which of those really works, that people know when they need to take a pause and take a second look and not just simply trust the outcome.
Yeah, no, it's a really critical point. It's one of the things we have people at Wharton and other academic institutions doing really interesting research about that question. And I've been fascinated by even some of the work on fairness, where we can look at the bias in the AI, but then in some cases the human will reinforce the bias of the AI. So they'll disregard the AI when it's better and use the AI when it's not, and so forth. So It sounds like though you're optimistic that we can build these kinds of systems
Yeah,
that
I
address this.
am. I am, but
Yeah.
we have to focus on it.
Yeah.
Right. And what you just like, there's a lot of those types of examples that are counterintuitive. It's not just, there's lots of different outcomes we could get. It's not just, for example, that, it's possible that we need to do more, not possible. We definitely need to be doing more around thinking about correcting bias in AI. However, we should be thinking about designing these systems, given that human systems also have bias, right? And that you get these counterintuitive outcomes sometimes where people don't know how to spot that bias in the AIs, right? So we really have to be thinking about this complex set of interactions. And yes, I'm really optimistic that if we're, really paying attention to those dynamics and bringing in, I mean, there's a lot of literature on that topic, right? That we can bring into how we design these products, but we need to accelerate that, right? We really need to pay attention to it because that's as these things get more and more complicated and operating more and more at scale and much more in a customer facing capacity. Well, we need to understand those interaction dynamics in a much more detailed way as we're designing the products.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of work left to do, but a lot of exciting potential. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And thank you so much for sharing with us the things that you're doing at Salesforce.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.